Hello and welcome to this, our next webinar in the series designed to give you a little bit of an insight into the way that the medical device regulations work here in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about conformity assessment and conformity assessment bodies. And I'm really pleased to welcome James Pink back to our webinars. So that we can go through that really tricky topic. James is a senior director at Element, a consultancy company, but has over 25 years of experience in the medical devices industry, including 10 years as a health technology expert and lead auditor for a leading European notified body. He began his career as a product designer in the oil tools industry, moving into medical devices when he got involved with physics and clinical engineering at the Royal Hallamshire Hospital in Sheffield. His industry experience includes managing product development and quality assurance programs for both active and non-active medical devices, as well as those related to combination products. James is a contributor to several medical device standards committees, including those in ISO, which are responsible for standards such as 13485 and 14971 on risk, as well as looking into a number of product-related standards themselves. So it's really great to welcome James again to our webinar series. As I say, this time to talk about conformity assessment. So welcome, James. I'm really glad that you're here to talk about conformity assessment because it's one of those areas which confuses the hell out of me. So to have an expert like you here to walk us through it and walk through what the process means is a fantastic opportunity for us, and I hope for the guys who have downloaded the webinar. So let's start off. Conformity assessment. I know that when I look at the regulations, there are different approaches to conformity assessment that I can take. But can you just describe those for us and sort of just give us a little bit of an insight as to what should influence my choice of route?
Yeah, sure. I think the first point is the direct linkage between device classification and conformity assessment. In the webinar that we did on classification, we make it pretty clear that regulatory agencies, notified bodies get involved when the risk is high enough to, provide assurance that, a third-party conformity assessment has occurred. So we start there really in terms of what options we've got. And in the medical device regulations, in vitro diagnostic regulations, dependent upon the classification and also the type of devices will largely sort of dictate what sort of routes are available to you. And they're in what they call the conformity assessment procedures. And the procedures that you've got available to you really are, I guess, reflecting what sort of intention you've got in terms of the market. So if we're talking about the old medical devices directive and the in vitro diagnostics directives, they were all sort of based around the new approach regulations where, products were actually tested for safety. They were type tested. Homogeneous products were sampled, and samples of, if you had 100, let's say, condoms or surgical gloves, you would have a batch verification, and a notified body would be involved in sampling, agreeing the sample plan, taking the product and inspecting it against inspection and test criteria that the notified body and the manufacturer had sort of evaluated and agreed up front. You have the type testing, which is, you would actually design and develop and then freeze the design, and you'd get engage either one or more laboratories to independently evaluate the product for electrical safety, for usability, for electromagnetic interference, that type of thing. So you would have this type testing open to you, which, as we said, sort of the history of conformity assessment was shaped around those sort of methods and mechanisms. Do we type test? We used to typically type test a lot of active electrical medical devices because in the old days, there weren't that many of them, and they were, you would only have one or two sort of, let's say, pulse oximetry devices. You'd only have one or two ECGs, EEG devices. So ultimately, you would prefer to send that to a really competent laboratory to make sure that the leads wouldn't electrocute you, and to make sure that the energies were safe, the circuits were safe, and to ensure that it wasn't going to have interfere or be damaged by any other external emissions, so it would work. So there's a lot of history in that, Phil, and that history is carried over into the conformity assessment options. Now the options have become a little bit more limited in the sense that you can still do a type test and you can still have batch verification, but most often in medical devices now, the preferred option is to have your quality management system evaluated for both design, manufacture, and of course, actually for post-market as well, and to have your technical documentation assessed. And then the notified bodies make a determination about what additional testing they may require based upon what information has been presented on the application for, demonstrating that you've addressed the general safety performance requirements or essential requirements. And then there are just different routes from there. So if we take it from an example, if you have a class 2A medical device, you have some routes available to you. Number one, you don't have to type test, so you don't have to take what they call the Annex 10 route. You can take the Annex 11 route, which is the batch verification sort of product quality route, or you can take Annex 9 and you only have to have a technical file assessment for each sort of category of device. So depending on what categories you've got, then that would be a one and done. You would submit the technical documentation, it would be assessed, and then now you're in the routine of change control, and provided you don't change anything, provided everything's okay, you'll just receive sort of periodic assessments and reassessments, and of course the surveillance in the quality management system. So whereas with a class 3 medical device that perhaps has a medicinal substance that is acting ancillary, you've still got those three options, Annex 9, which is your quality management system, your technical documentation. You can now, because it's class 3, take the option of type testing, but you'd have to have really, really clear sort of common specifications, harmonized standards, and a very, very clear knowledge about what exactly needs to be tested to confirm the general safety or verified to confirm the general safety performance requirements, and then couple that up with the sort of production quality assurance routes as well. But the difference that you've got with the class 3, if it's got a medicine, for example, or if it's a class 3 implantable, is that there will be consultations as well with third parties. So, for example, the European Medicines Agency may have to be involved, or a medicinal products agency consulted around the safety and usefulness of the medicinal substance, for example. And because it's now a class 3 medical device under the new regulations, Article 54, Article 55, you'll see that the notified body has to also do a consultation with the medical device coordinating group to determine whether an expert opinion is going to be required on the clinical evaluation assessment that the notified body has conducted. So there's these wonderful bits of if and or type conditions that exist. But the most basic thing is that you classify your device, you look at what the classification rules are, and then based upon that, then there are various route options that you can take, either Annex 9 with your technical documentation, and dependent upon the classification, the amount of technical documentation assessed as part of the conformity assessment is determined, or you can do the type test options and the product verification options. So it is an or, and then either way, consultations would still exist if you have something like nanomaterials, if you had medicinal substances, if you had animal tissues, there may be some sort of involvement of third-party agencies as well.
So I remember back in the old days with the directive that one of the separators, if you like, between which route you took was whether or not you made millions of products or whether you made a one-off product. And I guess that's still the case, right? So if you're making something which you're not intending to change very often, then you would use your type testing, right? Whereas if you're doing huge batchfuls, then you might choose the other route.
Yeah, that option's there for you. It's strange because, back in the late 90s, we were shaped up as an industry to be able to do that. We had, the testing, inspection, certification industries and the notified bodies always had a lab next to them that was either material characterization, electrical safety. That's how we got to where we've got with notified bodies. However, under the new regulations and the growth of the notified bodies, I've seen less growth in the type testing capabilities and much more in the sort of the intellectual head sort of testing bit in terms of reading technical documentation.
Right.
And therefore that sort of adage of making a recommendation to a small, late stage innovative company that is only maybe even funded to get 10 devices made, that sort of decision around, well, perhaps take the batch verification option, perhaps take the type test option, is possibly now conflated with the capability and capacities of the notified bodies to run that conformity assessment route. So you would have to look at the NBOG NANDO database that's sort of supported by the European Commission. You'd have to look at that database and be very comfortable, firstly, of selecting the type of product code that you have. They call that the NBOG codes, and looking at whether or not the notified body can actually do the conformity assessment to that option. And I wrote an article called "Check What Condition Your Condition Is In" several, last year or the year before, with the status of notified bodies. And the observation I made there was that actually there's quite a lot of notified bodies who don't have full scopes, and they don't have the some can only do Annex 9.
Right.
So just bear that in mind. It's not just the size of your organization, how much budget you've got, and so on and so forth. It's actually, look, if you are looking to get to market and you believe, and you've got the evidence now for a safe and effective device, as you move into conformity assessment, the option is more driven by the capacity and capability of the notified body and the designation criteria.
So because of that sort of capacity and designation criteria, has the time at which a new company should consider when to engage and think about conformity assessment changed? Yeah. When about should you, if you're strategizing a regulatory function or strategy for a particular product, when about should you think of conformity assessment?
That's an excellent question. I think strategizing, you've got to do that as early as you can. And if you want to navigate the regulation, you need to be comfortable with the conformity assessment routes. And what you also need to be doing is sort of having a look at the notified body websites and familiarizing yourself with the fixed timelines that exist. So there's a life cycle in conformity assessment that's described in Annex 7 of the regulation, which starts from application, and the sort of assessment of the application, or if you want pre-application, the quotation stage. And then there's these fixed timelines in the regulation around some of the consultations. So if you have a device that has various characteristics and the conformity assessment rules, the classification rules, have certain considerations, then you'll have these consultations which have fixed time periods within them. So you can actually begin to look at, hold on a minute, when I submit my technical file, there's going to be a 60-day consultation, then there's another 60 days to return this information back. And then the notified body's got to, in that meantime, be planning a technical file assessment. They've got to be planning a quality systems assessment, or if it's a type test, they've got to arrange all of the laboratories, make sure that they've got the full scope of the standards that needs to be tested against. They may themselves be having to do work in terms of consulting with laboratories and understanding lab time and lab capacity. So the statement is strategize as early as you can. Get a roadmap in your head, in your organization. Get it down on paper or in a presentation or whatever, and then start to examine the fixed timeline and dependencies, such as medicinal consultations, such as clinical evaluation assessment reports, and the opinions of expert groups, clinical groups. And that way, then you'll get to see the big picture of just how long this process may be. And very typically for a sort of a medicinal product, with a device drug combination, which is an ancillary drug, you can be talking nearly 24 to 36 months in there with these various periods in time. And again, if you opt for a different conformity assessment route to the routine Annex 9, and you go to type testing, the notified bodies themselves they'll need to know early, that you want to take that route, so that they can then plan, the capacity to get those additional tests done and all the other bits and pieces in place as well. Sorry, that's very long-winded, but I think it's incredibly important to do that strategy. Very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's even more important now, knowing that the capacity within the conformity assessment body process is so limited.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, and what's interesting as well is your device groups. So if, what we're seeing is that the notified bodies have responded very much to the demand of the market. So we've had a proliferation of cardiovascular products. We've had a high proliferation of orthopedic products. We've always had a high proliferation of sort of non-active surgical type devices, usually polymeric, things like wound dressings and, surgical devices like breast implants and the like. So the notified bodies have got quite good capacity and capability in those areas. Whereas in some areas, maybe it might be software, it could be, something more specific around infusion, or it might be a particular novel device. They may have limited, the requirements for notification is basically one person per product code. And then after designation, maybe two people as a sort of a minimum. So that's not a lot of capacity if you think about how long, for a tech file assessment, it's usually 5 days. So, that's probably 30 or 40 files a year that they can get through and manage.
And as a manufacturer, I have the right as to who I go through to. Yeah. So I can look in on a list and find a conformity assessment body that I like.
Yeah, you can go onto the NANDO website. You can look at a designated notified body. And from that, the only thing to have in your armory is the knowledge of your what they call MDA, MDN, or IVD codes to basically get those codes familiarized. They're all online. You can go to the reference sites at the European Commission. It's on the MDCG website. You can look at those codes. And once you've done that, you can go to the NANDO website, and they've improved the filtering on that website. So you can actually filter by your codes now, and it will tell you the notified bodies that are available to you. And in doing that, they'll also tell you what conformity assessment routes those notified bodies can conduct. And then it's, like anything, go out there and talk to colleagues, friends about the services that you're getting from them, and select on that basis. But just remember that if the service from the orthopedics team might be different to the service from the active device team to the service from the wound care team, you just have to be sort of cognizant that it's not all the same experience.
So one last question on conformity assessment bodies before we move on to perhaps quality management systems. Sort of, if I'm a manufacturer and I've got the daunting task of looking at quality management as well as a technical file review, or I've got say 2 different products, can I have 2 different conformity assessment bodies?
You can't now. So under the medical device regulations, it's the notified body who is responsible for issuing the quality management system certificate and also the technical file or technical documentation certificate. So you can't sort of plug and play, well, I want these guys to do my sort of 2017 745 Article 10 quality system, and then meanwhile these guys go off and do my tech file assessment or my batch verification or my type testing. It doesn't work like that. A notified body is designated primarily on your device class and type, and as a result of that, they bear responsibility for the full conformity assessment and the issue of that sort of CE certification, be it whether it is the QMS certificate, the technical documentation certificate, or reviewing your summary of safety and clinical performance, and then putting the CE certification and all of the subsequent product information onto UDAMED to say, yes, we're their notified body. You can't split those responsibilities.
So it's really important then to make sure you get that choice right at the beginning, because, I remember even changing conformity assessment bodies is not as straightforward as you might think. So, you've got to make that choice right at the beginning.
You have, and as I said, that like anything in life, it's proper due diligence. We're not notified bodies are impartial, they're independent, highly scrutinized. There is an issue about variability, and it exists. We're not going to look through rose-tinted glasses here. Unfortunately, there is a huge difference between what German notified bodies are, and the competent authorities overseeing German notified bodies versus Irish notified bodies versus Dutch notified bodies. There is a variation. Now, despite the fact that the whole intent of the regulation was to reduce that variation, at this moment in time, it's increased the variation, and badly increased the variation. So you do need to do your due diligence, and one is not worse than the other, it's different. That's all I would say. So if you are culturally aligned to certain notified bodies, then you'll be a good fit. So think about that fit. Think about the capability of the notified body to provide service. And there's a lot of additional due diligence around, what is your future product portfolio going to be? Don't just stick to the fact that, these guys have got software. You might have some notified bodies that can do software. They can do quite a lot of active medical devices. But if you now want to do an implant, they might not be approved to do that. And again, that becomes incredibly difficult when you are wanting the technical documentation and the quality management system to be assessed. And unfortunately, what's going to happen is that the notified bodies, if you have to go to another one, you'll get that sort of repeat of the QMS in many areas, and it can be avoided by planning your product portfolio, doing your due diligence, and then selecting, an appropriate notified body to suit your needs.
Brilliant. So let's talk about quality management for 5 minutes. So you've worked extensively, I know, on 13485 standardization and audited plenty of companies against 13485. What are the major pitfalls that you see in QMS, and presumably in applying a quality management system, you have to almost strategize when you implement that in the same way as deciding which conformity assessment route to follow.
Yeah, I think thinking about the audience, if you've got a sort of a basic understanding that you need to implement a quality management system, many will sort of go off to maybe consultancies, and out of someone's briefcase or hard drive would drop a very generic quality system with all the right words, all the right headings, all the right titles, and potentially all the right forms. But the quality management systems are very, very dynamic now, and there's so many interactions. You know, if you look at the European medical device regulation, invest some time in reading Article 10. And the way to think of Articles 10 is, for the British amongst us, it's like a sandwich. You know, it's 2 loaves of bread and a piece of protein in the middle. And the 2 loaves of bread are sort of the most essential systems that have to operate together prior, you know, as part of the design, the risk and the manufacturing and the generation of technical documentation, etc. Those systems have to be operating really, really well. And the risk management system is just one example, as well as the post-market surveillance systems. And then the protein, which starts at Article 10, Section 9, is more about the processes of the organization. So there is something called a strategy for regulatory compliance, which is how are you going to keep up to date with all these changes to the regulations. You know, there are delegating acts, there are implementing acts, there are common specifications, there are harmonized standards. There are all these things that are what we could call configuration items that you have to stay on top of to be compliant. So it's not that you've got this cookie cutter piece of procedures. You've got to be willing to invest in something that is going to stay on top of these processes. And so the protein in the middle from Section 9 starts with the strategy for regulatory compliance, and then goes into the things that we know of, the processes for product realization, processes for risk management, processes for clinical. And then we come out of 9 and we go to 10. So still Article 10, but 10 onwards. And in there, we've got the post-market systems. So these are things like, what do we do if we've got non-conforming product and we know it's on the market? How do we communicate when we have an incident, a serious incident? What systems do we have in place? They're not what process and procedure, but what systems will now interact with the risk management system, the clinical evaluation process, what will update the technical documentation and the periodic summary update reports. And all of that is contained in Article 10. So the sort of the ISO 13485 bit has been harmonized against EU MDR now. So we're pretty cool on that, but there's still some differences. You know, we might have harmonized 13485, but what we've done is we've said this totality of 13485 fits into these articles in a certain way, but there are more article requirements in the regulation than there is. So it's not a one-to-one. So please remember that, you know, the strategy for regulatory compliance does not feature in ISO 13485, for example, but it is one of the most important configuration items as it goes. And I think, Phil, you asked me about, you know, I've pressure tested so many quality management systems over my lifetime, either from a conformity assessment process or from the nasty end of defending manufacturers' product liability law to see whether or not they were applying, you know, state of the art in their management systems. And the sort of the most pervasive failure is that lack of interaction of processes. That's it. You know, it's not the fact that, you know, the complaints handler has filled the right complaints form. It's not the fact that the quality manager has filled in the change control form. It's not, you know, all of those things are all okay, but it was something like the complaints process failed to drive back into the risk management process, right, which failed to identify trends, which failed to then notify regulatory agencies, which time then moved on. And now we're into a big sort of enforcement sort of situation, or, you know, you're getting suspensions or withdrawals, or you're having restricted scopes, and it's beginning to hurt you. So I think it's the interactions that you really have to think about in your quality management system, and design them well. They don't have to be the most, you know, beautifully compliant to every single word in the in the standard, but they have to be built well. So like a human being is, we can all have our little, set traits. Some can have big noses, some can have no hair, all this type of stuff. But if your body's functioning well, if your nervous system, your immune system, your skeletal systems are working together to keep you alive, to grow, to achieve whatever goals you want to achieve, that's great. It doesn't always have to look perfect, but those systems have to interact so that you can survive and thrive. And as a small manufacturer, that's something that you really need to be pushing to ensure that happens in your systems.
So coherency and joined up writing, is essentially that. The way that you sort of described all of that, maybe this is not a question for this particular session, but what influence do you think the fact that the new regulations in Europe seem to have adopted into law much more of those quality principles, don't they, than the previous directives? What influence does that mean, and what does that mean for a manufacturer? Does that change the way that you think about quality?
I think it will, yes, because of the interactions. We might have built risk management systems on the basis of 13485 linking with ISO 14971, which is the risk management standard. But you look at the regulation, and there's so many different sort of interactions around benefit risk decision making, and benefit risk ratio, benefit risk analysis, benefit risk determinations, and you can see that the regulation is now going to shape your system much more than maybe if you were purely a 13485 certified manufacturer going to the US or under an MD-SAP's jurisdiction, for example. That the MDR, European Medical Device Regulation, European IVDR regulations are forcing systems to work differently, but yet they're the same titles, if you wish. So it's forcing different interactions that perhaps your systems, or people who've been advising you on systems or been working in systems, you might employ someone who's come from another medical device company down the road, and now they're coming in and building a QMS with you. Well, they'll naturally resort to their habits, or
right,
what pressures they've had from other notified bodies under the old regimes. And you'll find that that's a distinct difference. You might as well prepare for it now. And, and I'm making it sound like really, really complicated. It's not. It really isn't. It's just there's a lot of things to think about. And if you think about that sandwich again and start to think about how can I build a good risk management system that is going to talk to my post-market surveillance, that is going to listen to my clinical evaluation, how do I build that, and you've got a lot of freedom to be able to do that to do what you're going to do in the build, but make them talk to each other.
The way that you've described all of the way that quality management system all works, I think that maybe we can use this as a segue into my last question, which is more around globalization. As we've now left Europe, and we're thinking about different ways of dealing in a globalized market. I've heard about the Medical Device Single Audit Program, or MDSAP. How does that relate to working with quality management systems that we traditionally work with here in Europe? Is it different? Is it the same? How would I strategize for that?
I think, the Medical Device Single Audit Program was written based on ISO 13485. And in fact, we updated ISO 13485, so the Medical Device Single Audit Program would adopt 13485. There was a lot of, what soul searching by the FDA, a lot of sort of soul searching by Anvisa in particular, because these were two very distinctly different sort of regulatory sort of regimens, if you wish, or mechanisms. To what we were more used to in Canada and Australia, which was much more of a European sort of, CE type conformity assessment type approach. And, we rewrote 13485 to bring in to the processes regulatory requirements at certain stages. So, if you're designing a product, consider regulatory requirements around the design inputs, for example. If you are running and operating a post-market surveillance system, consider the laws of the jurisdiction that you wish to go to in terms of what post-market surveillance activities you have to undertake. So 13485 and MDSAP is a wireframe that has these little wormholes to the regulatory requirements of Australia, Brazil, Canada, Japan, obviously the USA. And I and colleagues, Rob Ruff at NSF, for example, who was one of the pioneers with Kim Troutman and many others on the MDSAP audit model itself, have already written how the European regulations, the directives, can work within the MDSAP program. And it sounds like, how can it work in the MDSAP program? That's a little bit of a red herring. How it can work with this MDSAP audit model, which the audit model works with ISO 13485. So, I think once you've thought about things a bit logically, you get yourself a spreadsheet or whatever mechanism you get to be able to track the requirements. You look at all of the requirements in 13485, or you look at the audit model and the chapters and the tasks, and then you can just basically slot in where either the MDD, the UK regulations in future, or the MDR, where they fit, and exactly what do we need to do within those processes. And it's always been the same, Phil. If you have the definition of an incident has to be known, and if the definition of an incident, and it is different because we've got adverse event and serious adverse events in the US, and we've got incident and serious incident in Europe for post-market events, should I say. We know that there are different reporting criteria, different timelines, different sort of things you have to do in terms of, in Europe, we have to fill in an incident report form with all the root causes and all the other bits and pieces. And we've got certain timeliness around 2 days, 10 days, 30 days. And the US has got different requirements. Simple, they've got the MDR requirements. So it still doesn't mean we can't operate a 13485 vigilance process or, reporting process. It just means that we have to know what the laws are for the jurisdictions that we're reporting within. So I don't see any problem with the MDSAP, to be honest.
Brilliant. So almost a vision in the future, really, as to what we can potentially achieve from a global process. That sounds brilliant.
Yeah. I think the biggest change is, and this is the thing that's still being discussed at the IMDRF level, is actually a single review program. So right. Not MDSAP in terms of a single audit program, but actually the sort of the disciplines and the parameters placed around verifying the essential safety and performance criteria and clinical data. Can that be leveraged because the US, CDRH have done a review already, or maybe a European notified body has assessed the technical file? Can those be more harmonized to enable, mutual recognition agreement, or to sort of increase the capacity of very, very finite resources in biocompatibility? How many people know about all this artificial intelligence stuff and how to make it safe? And that there's probably only about 250 people in the world who can do microbiological sterilization assessments against gamma radiation. So we have to share those resources as opposed to just tripling up on our work effort for the same thing.
So this is a really good time to finish perhaps this particular session. I think just as a reflection, as we've gone through some of the other modules and talked about some of those more product related issues, when you're sort of thinking about strategy for regulation and meeting regulation, perhaps with conformity assessment, we're in this mode where you're not necessarily thinking about your intended purpose of your product or whatever. You're almost thinking about, well, where do I want to sell my product? Which markets do I want to go into? How do I then sort of build my strategy externally as well as internally? So I think that there are some really important things to sort of try and gather from those particular sections within the regulations and to make them work for you.
Absolutely. And I think that that's very, I'm seeing personally more organizations that are developing what we used to call Me Too products. There's already a product out there on the market where we've got some sort of prior art, but it's not so different that everyone's shaking. And we know that the US FDA system of substantial equivalence is much more certain than perhaps what we do under the European medical device regulation and all of the clinical data that's going to be required for it. So you see that you have to ask different questions around your strategy of where you want to go in the market, and then position yourself in that way. If you've got more of a novel device that doesn't have a product code in the US and wouldn't necessarily, get that sort of that de novo sort of decision making to reduce the class from a pre-market authorization route, you may find yourself better off doing those clinical studies in Europe because you're closer, you understand the system more, you can interact more with key opinion leaders and the sort of the people who are monitoring the studies. You can negotiate with a competent authority in terms of the clinical study design, etc. But everything, it's horses for courses, Phil. It really is, and it's, I won't say it's complex. You just have to you have to be very methodological in your approach to where you want to go with your markets, and then how you select your sort of regulatory quality system facing activities. Brilliant.
Thank you again, James, for your time. And it's been really good to talk about conformity assessment. As I say, it's one of those areas which is always, I've always struggled to get to really understand. But you make things sound complex but simple at the same time. So thank you so much, James, for joining us in this webinar. And we'll see you again soon.